I'm actually a Queens girl. So I'm coming from Queens, New York, even though I do live in Brooklyn now. And I am also the senior fellow at the African History Project, which is based in London, but is a global team. So we have people in Africa, we have people in the UK, we have people in Brazil, we have people in Paris. So I also come from that sort of like global team.
Hello and welcome to Obehi podcast. I'm your host, Obehi Ewanfo, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started into this episode.
I am a graduate student at the City College of New York, where I, of course, am studying African history. And my kind of like core love is the continent, even though I do dabble in diasporic history, being a diasporan myself. My father is from Belize and my mom is an African American. So that's just a little bit of history about me. And I know today we're going to be talking about this revolutionary who is absolutely foundational to my thinking. He is foundational to my historical practice. He was the first person I ever got published on.
Hello and welcome to Obehi podcast. I'm your host, Obehi Ewanfo, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started into this episode. The first thing that usually, of course, we will do it here often, is that we try to know the person behind the story. So in this case, I'm going to learn a little bit about you. Tell me a little bit about you as you were growing up. What were the things that formed your personality? Help me with that.
Yeah, of course, I would love to talk about this. So one of the things that is absolutely foundational to me, I told you that my father is from Belize. And I remember when I was a child, he used to he's an immigrant from Belize, and he immigrated before Belize even got its independence in 1981. And he used to keep the CD in the car by this artist named Andy Palacio. And Andy Palacio is a Garifuna artist. And for people who don't know, Garifuna is a West African descendant group that had migrated to St. Vincent and then migrated to Central America, where Belize is at. And this album was so different because, you know, being in Central America, a lot of the music is like Latin American inspired, in either in Spanish, and Belize is kind of unique in itself because it was colonized by the British. So it's an English speaking country. But this particular album was in the language of Garifuna, which is a mix of indigenous American language and African language. And the Garifuna in particular came from Nigeria. They originated in Nigeria. So
my country.
I love Nigerians. I have so many Nigerian friends. But yeah, so like this album, like I remember just loving this album, and and of course, like you grow up and you grow out of that kind of stuff. And then like I recently came back to this album a couple of years ago, and I was like really, and like now I'm like more interested in like Black history and African history. So I was just like been thinking about that album a lot and how that sort of cultural influence in different like subtle ways has really been foundational to like who I am today. With like my father is, he's not like, hasn't been through the education system in the way that I have, but he has always been interested in history, has always exposed me to that sort of thing. And my mom is also just like a proud Black woman and like has always encouraged me to have that sort of pride about myself as well. So I think the mix of those two experiences has really like helped me develop into being an African historian today.
That's interesting. All right, now let's have a bite of what we are here for. Thomas Sankara, give us a little background about him as a child.
Yeah, so Thomas Sankara was born his family was the only Christian family, an extended family of Muslims. But I think that speaks to like Africa as a continent, how tolerant they are of religion, right? I think especially in Nigeria, there's, a big tolerance of religion. And his father, I think the most important part was that his father was a colonial guard. So his father was actually not even like a leftist, like revolutionary. His father was like kind of a conservative. He believed in France, the colonial government. He believed that these things were good for African society. So as a colonial guard, Thomas Sankara and his siblings and his mother, of course, they moved around the area a lot. So they were exposed to a lot of different cultures. I mean, Thomas Sankara himself spoke about like at least three different languages, including French and some indigenous languages. So those experiences, and one of the things that I talk about in an essay that I wrote in The Republic, which is a Nigerian magazine, is that, this experience of having the social mobility of his father being a colonial guard, that means that Thomas Sankara was able to go to school. He was able to travel around and meet all these different people from all these different cultures. I think that experience really just like made it possible for him to be who he was today, which is like a very inclusive person, a very revolutionary person. It's ironic, right? Because his father was very like conservative and he was a colonial guard, but Thomas Sankara became the complete opposite. And the reason he became the complete opposite is because his father was a colonial guard and was able to give him the opportunities that his father didn't have.
Okay, now let's try to see also how he formed his own personality, because that is also very important. Okay, we understand now who his father was, and of course he have gotten the chance to be able to learn, because he have got it. Let's say he's a privileged child in this sense, no? So he was able to know some of the things that other people would not be able to have access to. So probably this was what led to his boldness also when he stood up for the system, as it were. So help us to navigate this little trajectory as he was trying to form his own idea, his own identity. Tell us about a bit about that.
Yeah, so I think one of the other most important parts is that Thomas Sankara was from, his family was chiefly of Mossi descent. And in Burkina Faso, Mossi was the dominant ethnic group. So again, he had that social mobility. So of course, in Burkina Faso and in colonial societies in general, the one avenue they have for education is the military. And so that's what Thomas Sankara pursued. So most of his education, like, of course, you go through primary school and stuff like that, but most of his like higher education, middle school, high school, college, that was basically military training. So he trained in Burkina Faso for a little bit. And then he actually went to Madagascar when Madagascar was going through their revolutionary period. So he kind of just got exposed to that revolutionary mindset that was in Madagascar. And then he returns back to Burkina Faso and just for a little bit. And then he's kind of like trying to navigate his way through society with this new kind of like ideology that's kind of like weighing on his mind. And then he goes to France and he goes to train in France or in Paris, right? And again, like it's not that Europe isn't having its own revolutions, right? Like, I mean, you have Marxist revolutions in Europe, you have all kinds of fascist things happening in Europe, and all kinds of, again, like Portugal is going through their thing as well. So he's also in Europe where like revolution is, is very much active. France has, just lost Algeria, right? And that was a big thing. That was a big bloody war. So all of these things, this military training that allowed him to go navigate through all these different regions and spaces under this revolutionary period is what really, really put forward his ability to be this like radical revolutionary that we love to talk about.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, this period that is beginning, that of course, he has formed himself now. Are there some people maybe that have supported him to be able to grow to the level that he became? Because now he began to wield a lot of influence. Okay, he was not the most popular, he was not the most powerful person in Africa, but now he's beginning to have his leg and hands planted in some places that he could make a move. So I'm trying to understand if there were some people that helped him to get to where he wanted to go.
Yeah, I mean, of course, like being able to navigate all these different spaces, you're dealing with a whole bunch of different revolutionaries. I think, and this is somebody that we'll obviously talk about a little bit later, but his companion, his essentially brother, Blaise Compaoré, was also somebody who was heavily influential to his ideology. But I think Thomas Sankara, what really him being kind of like, I think like we think of him as this radical revolutionary and this like grassroots kind of guy, but like he was a voracious reader, right? Like he read people like Fanon. He didn't like being called a Marxist or a communist, but he did read a lot of like Marx and Lenin, and he says that out of his own mouth. So I think that of course, he had his teachers who were very influential to him during his military training, but I really think that his ideological his ideological like structure came from those sorts of like readings that are even so popular to this very day. I mean, in college, you can't escape Marxism, right? Even if you're not a Marxist, you have to study it, especially if you're going to be a historian, African historian, if that. So I think that these texts are really, really, and even the Bible and Quran, you know, Thomas Sankara talks about how if he was on a deserted island, the only books that he would bring is the Bible, the Quran, and Lenin's State and Revolution. So I think these are the texts that have really capture how his ideologies, you know, formed.
Mm-hmm. All right, now I have a curiosity. You know, this is a system that the Europeans have a pretty strong grip of. You know, looking at Africa, looking at the colonial African as it were. Of course, even what he did, the Europeans still have a very strong grip of Africa. They still control the system, no doubt about that. So, whether at the time they were trying to exit and shift some of the responsibility to some other person who they can control, or even them, that because of course, you know, Africa is a big continent, no? For you to be able to control this continent, you're going to need hands. You're going to need Africans to help you to do this work, no? So I'm trying to see if it is possible that Thomas Sankara was trained to perform certain role for the European, but then he decided to carve his way out because he need to save his people instead of working for, call them the master if you want. So it's just a curiosity. I'm trying to see if there can be a scenario like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way we can look at it is that, you know, Burkina Faso, before Thomas Sankara rose to power, Burkina Faso had already been independent since I think 1960. So, you know, Burkina Faso was going through all these coup d'etats, right? Like there were, I mean, between the time that Thomas Sankara became president and Burkina Faso getting its independence, there were like 5 coups. So, you know, Thomas Sankara worked his way through at least like 2 or 3 of these coups, and he worked in 2 or 3 of these governments. And you and I both know that many of these governments that were in African societies, especially during this like revolutionary period, were puppet states, right? They were puppet states for France. They were puppet states for Great Britain. And Thomas Sankara got caught in that, right? He got caught in not being able to really speak his mind, or he got caught in performing these sorts of these duties, even going to train in Madagascar, right? Like he wasn't going to train in Madagascar to fight on the side of the revolutionaries in Madagascar. He was training in Madagascar to quash those sorts of rebellions that were happening all over Africa. But when we look at, you know, the government that was before Sankara's government, which was the Council of the Salvation of the People, I think it was called. That was a puppet state. And Thomas Sankara openly spoke out against a lot of the things that were going on in Burkina Faso, and they imprisoned him. They jailed him, right? And that was the whole way that he actually came to power in the first place, because they jailed him and people wanted to free him. So I do think that Thomas Sankara did perform in a certain way that sort of like reactionary role, but I think that he navigated it very, very successfully and really made a name for himself, getting out of that mindset and actively working for the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is very important. Now, I'm going to ask one more question related to that, because of course we know that in the society, there are many people who love the truth, and sometimes they are ready to sacrifice themselves for it. Of course, these are common in many society, you know. But of course, there are some people, anyway, I'm going back to the same question that I asked before, no, who really do love the people, but they don't have, sometimes they don't even understand yet what is their role. No? Of course, we can also find this, even in the Roman Empire, people who have been working for the state or working for the system, but at the point they say, okay, no, I've suffered enough, or maybe I realize that what I'm doing is wrong. Now I want to work against you in the defense of the people. No? Sometimes we also see characters like this. No? So I know that I asked the question before whether Thomas Sankara could have been helped to get to his position. So you just responded just now that, okay, he has already been voicing out even before he came to power. Is that correct? So
yeah.
What I'm trying to understand there now is, since when did he begin to make his mission, or can we call it his vision, known? That he began to suffer for it. Eventually, he lost his life for it. Since when did he begin to talk about his idea of Africa, his idea of Burkina Faso, his ideal society that he was prepared to sacrifice something for. When did this one begin?
I mean, to be honest, I think that this started at a really early age. I mean, based on the things that I've read, Thomas Sankara had always had that personality. Even as a youth, he had that personality of like bucking against the system, like we say. Um, there are many instances of him, speaking out against like smaller injustices in the schoolyard. So he always had that sense of like morality and justice in society. So I think that firstly, I would say that this started at a very, very young age. Thomas Sankara had always been sort of this like revolutionary, mindset. And I think that happens for a myriad of reasons. But I think that, again, that visitation to Madagascar and then later France, which I think he came back from France in like 1978, I believe. Somewhere around the 1976 or 1978. I think once he returned back to Burkina Faso, like that was it for him. A lot of people, they leave, their home countries and they go to the colonial countries. They go to Paris, they go to Great Britain, and they stay there and they fight their revolutions from those countries. But he wanted to go back and be there with the people. And I think that comes from his studying of Frantz Fanon, quite honestly. And Frantz Fanon was an Algerian. Well, he was an Algerian. He fought in Algeria. He's Martinican, but he fought in the Algerian Revolution. And Fanon was a humanist in the most strictest sense, in the most literal sense. And he believed that you literally had to fight alongside the people. So I think that Thomas Sankara, in that time in Paris and Madagascar and seeing those revolutions taking place and coming back to Burkina Faso in the late 1970s is really when he started to pick up more of a political public role, because then he started getting these roles in the government, like smaller roles, right? Like commissioner, or I think at one point he was like the secretary of like press, like journalism or something like that. So like he was already working with the public, right? Like through press and journalism and stuff like that. And then like slowly climbing up the ladder. So I think in the late 1970s, when he started like getting these smaller roles in government, is when he started to voice his political opinions on a more public platform.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. Now, as we're talking about the idea of Marxism, the idea that this idea that Thomas Sankara was trying to promote, actually he promoted, not that he tried, he promoted, and a lot of Africans still promote today. Can we say that they are coming from somewhere, or they were already an African idea that was sort of lying, and suddenly they woke up because there were some individuals who were ready to expose them before the people?
Of course. Of course. I think that, many African societies, right? Like I think sometimes we generalize too much, right? Like we have to remember that Africa is still a very diverse place. Like colonialism hasn't made Africa a less diverse place. But I do think that in traditional African culture, the idea of community ownership is very central to traditional African philosophy, that nobody owns one particular space. Even, kings, like the great kings of Africa, right? Like, yes, they had a lot of wealth but like, if somebody wanted to leave an empire, all they did was move away and move to a different community, right? So like this idea of nobody owns one thing, that we're all here to live on this earth. We're all here to live on this land and to live collectively and to share with each other. That is something that is very African, very traditionally African. It's something that you still see in Africa today. It's something that you see in the diaspora today. Like it's not even just like a continental thing. It's something that you see in all Black people today, that we are willing to share with each other. So this idea of Marxism, yes, like I think it was something that like connected with something that was already internal to the African mindset, the African philosophy. So yeah, and I also think that Thomas Sankara, he understood the limits of Marxism in Africa, right? Because Marxism is about a proletarian class. There was no proletarian class in Africa at that point. And Thomas Sankara also drew his Marxist example from the Cuban example. There was no proletarian class in Cuba either. So that's where they turned their attention now to the peasant class. And who were the peasant class? The people who were farming, the people who were dealing with cash crops and things like that. Cash crops and all those sorts of things. Who was that performed by? That was previously performed by slave labor. So I think that, Marxism, it gave it a name, and it gave it something that people could grasp onto. But these are all things that are historically deeply already tied to Africa way before Marx even wrote his little spiel in his little corner of Europe in the 1800s, right?
All right. The class you are talking about, the Marxism, you said, was it really there in Africa? Can you like expatiate a bit?
Yeah, I mean, again, like Marxism in Africa is like just a really funny topic because it fits in some senses, but it also so Marxism really is like a class concept, right? Like it's really concerned about like wealth and economics. And I think that the reason why it wasn't exactly too successful on the continent is because it didn't take into consideration issues of race. And I know even race on the continent is something that's very, very like strange or something that's not necessarily like too talked about. So I think because there was no when I say proletarian class, I mean people who were that means just like workers, right? Workers, but who are like organized on a certain level, right? That was not such a thing in Africa. Like there were agricultural people, there were farmers, but there wasn't like a proletarian industrial class, I should say. Like there were people who were working in factories and things like that. And that's what Marx was basing his theories on. So the first time you see like Marxism being placed into this kind of like peasant context was in Cuba. And I think that a lot of African leaders drew from that Cuban example that instead of mobilizing this non-existent proletarian class, that there's no proletarian class in Africa, instead of mobilizing that non-existent class, then they said, okay, like, and who is the oppressed class here? And that is the agricultural class, right? That's and the equivalent to the agricultural class in Africa is slave labor in the United States or in Haiti, in Jamaica, those sorts of places. So I think there are real limitations to Marxism in Africa. And I think the reason why it wasn't super successful is because in addition to class, right, that, it didn't even match with perfectly either, it also didn't take into consideration race, which is very, very important. I understand that race is like a social construct, but still to this day, there is a racial concept in Africa where light skins are more, seen on the Nigerian, billboards rather than darker skinned people and things like that. In South Africa, South Africa is still basically going through apartheid, even though we don't like to admit it. So again, like race in Marxism, or the absence of race in Marxism, I think is where Marxism failed in Africa, even though this idea of like community ownership is something that's very African, right? It's very African, but I think that Marxism has its limitations because it doesn't take into consideration the very specific historical concepts that are in Africa.
So if Marxism, actually the real concept of it, no, even though it's that of be so much philosophized as it were, is actually in Africa because it's in the day-to-day life of the people. It means that many Africans should be aware of this, no? What I want to say is that if Thomas Sankara was able to understand this, it means that many other Africans, both in his time and even up to this time, should be able to understand it. But why are they not propagating the same idea that Thomas Sankara did?
Well, I think that this idea of, the government owning things, like, yes, that is a Marxist concept. But I think the problem that African countries like Burkina Faso end up having is that they're modeling Western governments, which is not, Western governments is not the same thing as a traditional African government. And not that there's not supposed to be some sort of evolution, but when a people are used to working under a certain social system, and then you try to completely replace that with a system that is completely foreign, I think that's where the problem comes. So Thomas Sankara, right, like this idea of like the land is owned by the people, the people work the land, and therefore the people own the land, right? I think because, Thomas Sankara included, right, like we have to call a spade, because Thomas Sankara and other African leaders tried to model their governments on Western governments. That's why we see things like the government owning things, right? Like owning things in a very, very like different way than Thomas Sankara had envisioned it. And again, I think that's because like we're trying to model these Western governments. So now people see that, now the government, look, there's your Marxism. The government owns things. Look how well that turned out for us. But that's not what Thomas Sankara envisioned. But the reason why it didn't work out is because, again, we're modeling Western governments. So I think that's the disconnection between like why people are not embracing this sort of like, Marxist point of view. I would like to call it a traditional African point of view, is because we've taken this traditional African point of view and framed it in a Western mindset that doesn't connect with who we are intrinsically. But that's what I would say about why people aren't really grasping at what Thomas Sankara really tried to put in place in Burkina Faso and in Africa in general. I mean, like, he was all over Africa, not just Burkina Faso.
But even this idea of copying Western style, which of course we do in many parts of Africa, in Nigeria, for example, up in the First Republic in Nigeria, where we're having a kind of the British system as it were. But then, okay, we want to Americanize the system, but it's even very forced as it were, no? Because we don't really practice the American system in Nigeria in the real sense of it. We are just practicing a kind of a false idea of it. Because the Nigerian labor, nobody really care much about them. The infrastructure are not developed. So how are we practicing the system if we are just only, the state is just there as a monopoly of violence? You are basically abusing the people. But that is not what the American system is.
Yeah, I mean, when I say modeled after Western society, so like, remember, in this revolutionary period, right, the colonial government is already put in place, like way before Thomas Sankara, way before Amilcar Cabral and Agostinho Neto and all these people, right? Like, the colonial government is already put in place. And instead of these governments being transformed, right? And when we say like colonial governments are modeled after, like, they are modeled after Western governments, but they're modeled in a very limited sense because they're only there for one thing, and that's to extract wealth. That's the only thing they're there for. They're not there to settle and all that. Like, they're there to gain wealth from Africa. So when you have these colonial governments that are already set in place, then you have revolutionaries who are simply, revolutionaries, right? Like, who are essentially just taking over these colonial governments. They're just entering into the same system, but now it's just Africanized. Now it's just Black. Seldom do we actually see a lot of African governments like saying like, we're getting rid of this whole thing and we're just going to build something completely different. It's most of the time, it's like, we already have this colonial government in place, and now we just want Africans controlling it. And I think that was the first mistake in revolutionary Africa, right? That there wasn't an actual like total upheaval of the colonial government. It was actually just a replacement of colonial officials, and now it's just Africans controlling those governments. And that's why you see a lot of corruption in the government, right? We talk about it. I think, who is it? Walter Rodney, who says, to be like rich or to be popular, to be famous in Africa is just to be a civil servant. That he says that for a reason. And he says that because, again, like, I think one of the main mistakes that, a lot of the revolutionary period had was the fact that these governments weren't radically transformed. They were simply just taken over. They were simply just Africanized. And that's what I mean by modeled after Western governments. I don't mean that they took their governments and literally just like, oh, we're going to copy the American system, we're going to copy the British system. But it's like, these colonial governments were already put in place and we're just going to take them over. Simple.
Maybe we're just copying the wrong part of it, because as it favors us, let's take it as the ruling elite. If it favors us, okay, that is fine. But if it's for the people, we don't really care about them. Because I think sometimes it is difficult to form a society. It is difficult to run the machine of a state. I want to believe exactly that power actually corrupt. And absolute power corrupt absolutely. Because if you don't hold the power accountable, then it just is dangerous. Mm-hmm. The African ruling elite have total control of the system. The people are not able to challenge that system, and that system therefore have not really passed through the process of refining, because mm-hmm. They are too afraid to challenge, or maybe they are not being given the instrument to challenge it. For that, the system is not really working. I want to believe that the way the colonialists left Africa is more or less the same level as it is today in terms of infrastructure. I'm not saying you don't see tall buildings here and there, but come on, compared to what we really expect as a people to grow, it's too small, it's too meager. Just basic example. In Nigeria, there is still no light, no electricity. That is just minimal. is the bare minimum. If it were a system that is functioning, should consider what kind of a system is that. But if the people were equipped enough, they would challenge the system so that it can work for them. But because they can't challenge the system, that is this direct relationship that's supposed to continuously refine itself in the system of government, it doesn't seem to work. If you were to say, maybe in few words, what really separates Thomas Sankara from the cuckoo of government we have today, what would you say? What really separates him?
I think Thomas Sankara, that's interesting. What separates Thomas Sankara from the craziness that we have in Africa and in other Black civilizations today, quite honestly? I think Thomas Sankara, I think he had a really clear vision. And I think that his vision, I think one of his clearest visions was when he tried to get all of the African states to say, we're not paying Europe back. And what he said was, we paid Europe in blood for hundreds of years. And I think that those sorts of visions that he tried to rally Africa and other like third world country states, those sorts of visions, I think were very, very clear, and he did not mince his words. And a lot of revolutionaries like didn't mince their words, and they were very like powerful in how they spoke. But Thomas Sankara had real plans, and he worked alongside the people. I think that's something that's also very, very important. Like he literally, like you see images of Thomas Sankara building roads and planting trees and digging pits and going around and having conversations with students. And like, this is not something that he designated, okay, you go do this and you go do that, and I'm gonna go around and tour the country and go talk with all the great leaders, right? Like he was sitting side by side with his people. And you see that in other revolutionaries that I love to talk about, like Amilcar Cabral, I think was also somebody who was just like that. And Maurice Bishop was also like that as well. But I think that's something that's, you only see that with a few revolutionaries, and Thomas Sankara, I think was one of the last ones, right? Because Thomas Sankara was like, he died, I mean, this was recent, this was 1987, he died, he came to power in 1984, right? Or 1983, he came to power in 1983. So I think he's really one of the last revolutionaries to like really work side by side with his people with a very specific plan.
Thank you very much for that, dear Kaya. Okay, you see, why I like the conversation very, very well is that the idea that Thomas Sankara was promoted in Africa is not new to Africa. It's an African idea, which means the people should understand what he's saying. Something very simple, that we should produce what we eat and eat what we produce. This is not rocket science. This is something that should be simple for people to understand. Good example. Do the United States produce what they eat? Yes. Do Italians produce what they eat? Yes. If you attack Italy, can they have a kind of defense for themselves? Yes. But if you attack Nigeria, does Nigeria able to produce their own weapon to defend themselves? Can they really produce food to feed the population? Can they say, okay, you see, I don't think what Thomas Sankara was saying was really a rocket science. He was saying basic things. The same thing that many real responsible leaders should be saying. Look at the mass migration from Africa. An African leader who is responsible should have been thinking, why are the people leaving me behind? Why are they running away? You know what Nigeria president said one time? These are lazy youth. How can they be lazy youth when they are going to Europe and they are working there? How can they be lazy?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is something that Walter Rodney also talks about. He calls it brain drain, where because there are like, I mean, even like the Africans, right? I think the highest immigrant population from Africa in the United States is Nigerians. I think Nigerians followed by Congolese, but these are people that are like literally the smartest people. Like they're taking up the smart, like they're architects, they're doctors, they're, you know, lawyers. I mean, like even my own supervisor at the African History Project, like she's like a corporate lawyer. She was also an engineer. Like these are all like, there's no way that, you know, the youth are lazy or untalented or just like plain not smart. It's just that, again, because these countries, right, we have to think about it in context with history, because these countries have accumulated so much wealth from Africa, they can now afford to pay for the talent, right? They can now afford, like, these people, they're not leaving their homes because they want to leave. Nobody wants to leave their home, right? Like, yes, people want to go explore and so on and so forth. But if you can make a life for where you live and where you love, why would you leave? So people are leaving because the pay, like, let's just put it simply, the pay is better, right? The pay is better, and the opportunities are better, and the schools have, better opportunities, or whatever the case may be. And it's kind of a vicious cycle, right? Because the more Africans leave Africa to come to the United States, to come to Europe, to all these different places, the less these institutions have that sort of like caliber of students. So like they're even less funded because they don't have those caliber of students staying in those programs. So it's a vicious cycle. And this is why I really like Sankara's idea of, we already paid y'all. We already paid y'all in blood years ago. And it's time that I know we have this conversation about reparations and stuff like that, but it really is time for, us to really think about revisiting these institutions. Like, one of my dreams is to study in an African institution. Like, I actively seek out professors from African institutions in Nigeria as well. So yeah, I totally agree that the brain drain it's a vicious cycle, and I don't really have an answer to it, but I do think, like, again, like you said, Thomas Sankara was just saying things that was just basic common sense. Like, he wanted people to work in Burkina Faso. He wanted people to, again, to eat what they produce and produce what they eat. Like, he wanted them to do that because that's where you start. You don't start by importing things that you can't pay for, because that's how you get into that sort of cycle. But yeah, like, I totally agree. Like, there needs to be, like, we need to start thinking about our institutions a lot more seriously.
It's quite serious because now there is war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. Many African leaders, we can't have food to supply to the population. But are you guys crazy? This is the youngest continent in the world. The land is fertile. What do you need? Malaysia came to Benin, NIFOR, Nigeria Institute of Palm Oil Research. They took some palm oil. Today, Malaysia, the Asian country, are some of the biggest palm oil producers in the world. Because I think leadership is about the people, about the survivor of the people. So that, like Thomas Sankara went out to work with the people, that is how we need the leader to be. In that we should understand that we have a common problem, a problem for all of us in this country. Call it Burkina Faso or Congo or Zambia or Nigeria. Let's identify what is the problem. All of us, we are going to find a solution. Let's look at something very simple to understand. Crude oil. Nigeria crude oil is extracted in crude like that, and is sent outside like that in raw state, is refined outside Nigeria and brought back as a finished product. Mm-hmm. What kind of crazy leadership does something like that?
Listen, this is not something that is particular to African countries. This is something that has gone on throughout the 20th century. I'm not a Latin American historian by any means, but this is something that happened, I believe, in Mexico. Mexico tried to nationalize their oil system, and America went in there and told them hell no, essentially, and messed that all up for them in a myriad of ways that I can't necessarily speak to. But this is something that has been going on for centuries now. And then on top of that, I do think that when on the topic of like oil and things like that, I think that Africa needs to be more forward thinking, right? We are already phasing out of the oil very slowly, but surely. We are phasing out of the use of oil. So I think Africa needs to stop trying to catch up, right? I think Black people in general, like, yes, I'm an Africanist in that sense, but I think Black people in general need to stop trying to catch up. And I think that we need to be leaders, right? Because all the knowledge that the colonial powers got, they got that from Africans. They came to Africa and didn't know how to do anything, essentially, right? We're the ones who taught them how to forage for this or grow this or make this or blah, 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 and all that sort of thing. I think that it's time for us to stop trying to catch up and say, oh, we need to learn how to refine oil and do everything in-house. Like, yes, but I guarantee you oil will be obsolete in the next decade or so. We're not even going to be using that. So here goes Africa's now refining oil and nobody needs it anymore, right? So we need to be more forward thinking and say, okay, yes, we lost out on the oil thing. Maybe it's good, right? Because Africa, we don't need that kind of environmental disaster in our countries anyway, right? So maybe we didn't miss out on a good thing, on a bad thing or whatever, right? Maybe that's fine. Like they can have their oil, but again, like maybe we need to be more forward thinking and saying, okay, like now everybody's thinking about clean energy and how we can be more sustainable. Africans are like number one in knowing how to be sustainable. Like, why don't we start to try to like capitalize on that, right? Sustainability was our middle name before these people come in and mess up our thing, right? So being more forward thinking, I think, is what Africa needs. And that's what Thomas Sankara did. Like he was forward thinking. Like there's a whole bunch of things that are probably good for us right here in the now, but what about 5 years later? What about 10 years later? How are these things going to work out for us now? So I think, yeah, Thomas Sankara's ideas about like being more forward thinking is something that Africa also needs to like really, really look forward to, or really, really try to get a grasp on.
Thomas Sankara was a forward-thinking person, and he was killed in Africa by Africa. Tell me about the assassination. What do we know about that?
Oh, it is so unfortunate, right? You have to keep your friends close and your enemies closer. But so Thomas Sankara, remember I mentioned Blaise Compaoré a couple of minutes ago. Blaise Compaoré was Thomas Sankara's right-hand man. And he actually grew up with Blaise Compaoré. Like Thomas Sankara's parents like treated Blaise Compaoré like a son their whole life. And I think when we look at it in retrospect, Blaise Compaoré was power hungry. He just wanted power. He didn't really care about the people. He didn't really care that the people were progressing. And he just wanted to be powerful. So remember I said Thomas Sankara was he was in the CSP before he came to his own government. And when the CSP imprisoned him, Blaise Compaoré was actually the soldier that led the coup that freed Thomas Sankara and then put him in power. But when that coup happened, when Blaise Compaoré freed Thomas Sankara from prison in 1983, Blaise Compaoré thought he was going to be in power, meaning he thought Blaise Compaoré was going to be in power. They were like, nah, we're going to get Thomas Sankara and Thomas Sankara is going to be president. And I think that's where Blaise Compaoré started to, he started to switch up. So Blaise Compaoré the whole time is, again, like he got I think he got like prime minister or something like that in Sankara's government. So Sankara still kept him around and things like that. And then eventually people started telling Thomas Sankara, like, you need to watch this guy. He's plotting something. And then I think another figure who we need to bring into the conversation, who we don't identify enough, is Gaddafi. And Gaddafi, wanted Sankara to be more involved in the conflict that Gaddafi was in. And Sankara was like, I'm not really worried about that right now. I'm worried about Burkina Faso. Like, yes, I'm worried about Africa, but I'm worried about Burkina Faso first. And so Gaddafi kind of took offense to this and essentially conspired with the United States and with France and with Blaise Compaoré to take him out. So one fateful day in 1987, Sankara is leading some sort of meeting with his fellow politicians, and Blaise Compaoré's men go in and they storm. Blaise Compaoré's not there, right? He doesn't want to be associated with it. They go storm in, and Thomas Sankara, he actually comes out, and he comes out with his hands up, and they shoot him anyway. They shoot him and they shoot him down. And it is just the most unfortunate thing because everybody knew Blaise Compaoré was Thomas Sankara's like right-hand man. And to this very day, Blaise Compaoré has never visited Thomas Sankara's family, who was like a mother and father to him. And I think that says a lot about his own character. And luckily, I think over maybe like the past like 2 or 3 years, Blaise Compaoré, he's been in power since that coup, right? And then I think in 2013, 2014, the Burkinabé people finally got him up out of there and said, we've had enough of you. So he escaped to the Ivory Coast, the neighboring Ivory Coast, and he hasn't been extradited yet. I think he needs to be. But the men who actually performed the assassination have been on trial in Burkina Faso. So we'll see how that goes. But I'm waiting for Blaise Compaoré to get his due as well. So I don't know. But yeah, that's what we know about his assassination.
All right. Now, when are we going to learn? I mean, Africans, African diaspora, when are we going to stop shooting ourselves in the foot? Look at Gaddafi. Who killed Gaddafi? The same West, the America, the Europeans. This is a prize that is waiting for all of you that are shooting your brothers in the back. They will shoot you in your back too. You know, when you are a liar, you will always lie, because when you lie one, you will need to lie another one, you need to lie another one again. You can never be clean. You know the only thing that you need to sacrifice for your people. You will still die. Take it from me. You will still die. All of us will die. There is no one that is not going to die. But what do you want to die for?
I completely agree. And one of the things that another case that I think is very similar is Malcolm X, right? Who killed Malcolm X? Like, yeah, we talk about the CIA and we talk about, the United States government and Europe, like they shot our revolutionaries down. Like, yeah, but half of the time they're hiring other Black people to do their dirty work. The men who shot Malcolm X were Black people. It's the same thing with Lumumba. Who put Lumumba in the grave, right? Who put Maurice Bishop in the grave? All these people, they're being killed not by some random white person, from Europe who comes down out of their nice, comfortable house to come do their dirty work in Africa. They're hiring other Africans. They're hiring other Black people to do it. So we have to think about what is more important. Like you said, what are you going to die for? And what is more important to you? The money that you're going to get that you're probably going to blow anyway, or actually seeing that the foundation, that the social structure that you're in is going to thrive to put you in a position to make even more, right? And not even from an individualist perspective or like a capitalist perspective, but like to see that the hometown that you're from, that your children or your cousins or your family, your neighbors can also thrive in the same manner, instead of you essentially being a traitor. But also what I will say is that we have to remember that this concept of like the African is also really young. And before Europeans came down and started drawing up random boundaries and stuff like that in the 1800s, what did the Fulani people have to do with, I don't know, the Bori people, right? Like these are completely separate groups. So we also have to remember that these identities that we have as like African or like a Black person, like these are things that are still very, very complicated. And not
But I don't know if that really justify the atrocity that we are committing against ourselves. Because
right.
now, look at it. Blaise Compaoré and Thomas Sankara are in the same country. Even if they were to be, I don't think they're even from different ethnic background. That is one. Secondly, okay, it is true that in Africa we are coming from different ethnic background. We are not just one African nation together like that. There are thousands of ethnic groups in Africa. But we have not always been fighting every day. Sometimes we do fight too. We are still assassins. We are still killers. We are still hungry people. We are still hungry for power. We are just like every other people in the world. But we also make peace too. So what I'm saying now is, for the fact that, okay, now let's look at the one that is being accused of killing Thomas Sankara. Let's say he did that because because Thomas Sankara was no longer good enough. So he decided to come in as a leader, right? So as a leader, you were supposed to be there for the people. Can we see him pull it through what Thomas Sankara wanted to do, which is making sure that the people eat what they produce and produce what they eat? Can we have that one on the record?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, Blaise Compaoré, like you can even, the fact that Blaise Compaoré stayed in power until he came to power in 1987 and left power in 2013. So the fact that this man was in power for 26 years and nothing has changed in Burkina Faso says a lot about what his aim was in that assassination. Because if his real goal was to actually help the Burkinabé people, Burkinabé people would be helped. It would be much different. But I feel like, again, like you just said, Blaise Compaoré wanted power. And I don't think there are any excuses, even if he did come from a different ethnic background, there are no excuses for what he has done. But yeah, like I think Blaise Compaoré, I think the most interesting part to me, and maybe this is kind of very trivial, but I think the fact that he was so close to Thomas Sankara, right? And that really goes to like what you're saying, the depth of power hungriness that human beings can have. And I think that this is something that is exacerbated by colonialism, right? Everybody, I mean, we're human beings, right? We have the proclivities to be power hungry, to be money hungry. We have these sorts of proclivities. But I think that colonialism has brought out a certain character in humanity that has been unprecedented, like truly has been unprecedented. And I think had it not been for like, I mean, I don't want to, give them too much credit, but I think if it hadn't been for a certain level of colonialism, these things we would not be committing these sorts of atrocities against each other, like you said.
Okay, so at this point now, we should be learning. I want to believe that we are learning, that we should be strategizing. Because you see what happened in the case of Michael Means. Okay, it's only in the case of Martin Luther King, we can say that the person who killed him was not an African American or not a black person, But Thomas Sankara, we can see, is it Patrice Lumumba? So what I'm basically saying here is that us, Africans, we are not even helping ourselves to take the chain off our hands. We are not helping ourselves. By that, I mean, you see, it is hard, it is difficult, and it is very, very costly to be free. So some people don't want to be free. They enjoy to be slave, and they enjoy to put their people in this servitude. Because look at it, what Thomas Sankara was saying, I repeat again, it's not rocket science. It's just telling us, let us try to survive as a people. That is what people do everywhere. It doesn't mean we cannot fight. So if you take off this guy, you take it out, okay, fine. Now, are you going to leave the people orphan so that they can be at the main scene of the race? They are still your people. So what are you going to do about it now? You shot the man is dead. Are you going to eat the dead body? When are we going to take responsibility? That is actually the question. When, as Africans, are we going to take responsibility? Okay, now, I'm not saying this to say that the French or European or the American are innocent of this. But I cannot control that. Mm-hmm. I can only control myself.
Yeah.
And in this case, the African people. When are we going to take responsibility for our action? Please speak to that.
I listen, one of my favorite Black figures, is Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey speaks a lot to this. He says, yeah, we had colonialism. Yeah, we had slavery. Yeah, we out here in Jamaica, we out here in the United States, and we don't really belong here, but it's all right, it's cool. Because at the end of the day, the only way that we're going to get better is not by asking for any outside help. It's not about asking for reparations. It's not about asking, for people to be nice to us and people to acknowledge the atrocities that they've done. It's not going to be about any of that. The only way that we can help ourselves is by helping ourselves. We cannot ask. We cannot. If Europe and America had any plans to undo the trauma that they've done, they would have did it already, essentially. So we have to stop looking. This is one of my core philosophies, is that we have to stop asking for people to do stuff for us. Europe is not going to do anything for us. Britain's not going to do anything for us. France is not going to do anything for us. The United States is not going to do anything for us. They're not. Because if they weren't, they would have did it already. I mean, slavery ended in 1880, whatever, right? If they wanted to give us reparations, my bank would be full right. My bank account would be full right now. So we have, like Marcus Garvey says, we have to stop looking towards other groups to show us sympathy and to show us pity and to give us reparations, and not to say that we don't deserve it or that they shouldn't give it to us, but they're not going to. So what do?
We need to help ourselves. We are going to help ourselves. We are going to perish because there is no. I can tell you, Europe does not have any plan to help Africa. Because why should they help you? Are you not a human being? Are you not men and women that are not sick? If you want to fight, if you want to be free, fight for your freedom. Be ready to share your blood to be free. Otherwise, you don't deserve to. Here, if you are a historian, you know that Europeans shared their blood to be free. They didn't become be free. Not that African came to imprison them, but they imprisoned themselves because they be very barbaric for a very long time, killing each other, and they shared their blood to be free. So if we think that they will just suddenly come, United States will send their money to be protecting Africa, we are just deceiving ourselves. It will never happen. If African territory is going to be defended, it's going to be defended by the African Marine. Of course, this one I'm talking of the individual states. Nigeria want to have stable electricity, try to invest in your people, or you will remain in your darkness. Of course, Europeans will help you. They will come and take away more resources from your land because you are too stupid to understand that you deserve good treatment. All right, now let's come back to Thomas Sankara. Do you think that he might have made a mistake that led to his assassination?
Yeah, I think he was way too nice to people, like to put it like in a very simple way. I think he was too trusting. I think on one hand, it's known that he was somebody who made final decisions based on his own ideas. But I also think that he was too trusting of his political companions who honestly did not have the political and ideological training to actually do what he needed them to do. So one, again, like he trusted Blaise Compaoré, and that was just like his biggest mistakes that got him assassinated. But I also think that he put people in power who did not know that they were doing what they were doing, but he believed in their ideologies, right? Like they were ideologically aligned to him. So he's like, great, you have the same political philosophies as me, you go ahead and do this job. But they did not have the sort of training that he needed, that needed to be had to perform those roles. And I also think that, and I don't know if this is necessarily a mistake, but I do think that his rhetoric, his very clear and concise rhetoric about what he was going to tolerate from the colonial powers and what he was not going to tolerate from the colonial powers, I don't think it was a mistake, but I do think that's what put him into the ground. I think the colonial powers were very afraid of Thomas Sankara. France was very afraid of Thomas Sankara. And this is the funny part. The United States got involved in his assassination. What did the United States have to do with Burkina Faso? The United States never owned any property, any colonies in Africa. What do they have to do with Africa? Nothing. The United States, Burkina Faso is this small, little, tiny, landlocked country in the middle of West Africa. What do they care about Burkina Faso? I think, the reason I think the United States, if we're talking about the United States in particular, they were afraid of Thomas Sankara because he wasn't just destabilizing things in Africa, he was destabilizing things all over the world. I mean, you'll see images of Thomas Sankara in Latin America. You'll see it in the Caribbean. And the United States had all of their interests in the Caribbean and in Latin America. So he wasn't just this, African figure. He was in Europe. People had T-shirts with Thomas Sankara in Europe, in Asia, all these different places, right? So it's not that they were scared of Burkina Faso, right? But I think that just shows you the power of who he was, that the United States looked at this landlocked country who nobody even knew what it was. And by the way, Burkina Faso got its name from Thomas Sankara, which means land of the upright people. Its original name was Upper Volta, which was a French colonial name. So again, the fact that the United States had to look at this country and said, wait, what's going on over there? Because it's messing up stuff over here. And that was because Thomas Sankara. So they weren't necessarily afraid of Burkina Faso, but they were afraid of Thomas Sankara because Sankara was just that powerful.
All right. Now, the message of Thomas Sankara at the time, do you think the message was actually driven home enough that the people understood what he wanted? Because if the people understood what he wanted, when another person came in, he justified to the people, at least I think he explained to the people why he did what he did. And what did the people do back to him?
People loved Thomas Sankara. People, they saw him again. Thomas Sankara really was the people's person. Like he was the people's man. Like he would ride down the street on a bicycle, and you could talk to Thomas Sankara like you were talking to your brother, like you were talking to your son, or you were talking to your cousin. People loved Thomas Sankara. They really did. Even, it wasn't like, oh, he died and now everybody loves him. Like people actively loved him while he was living, and people were devastated at his death. And people gathered around whenever he held any kind of rally. Like you can read about it. Like you can read all his speeches. Like people gathered around, like Blaise Compaoré would talk, or somebody from the CSP when he was the prime minister there would talk, and like it would be like dead silence. And then Thomas Sankara would come up and everybody's like cheering and blah, 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 and going crazy, right? So people really loved Thomas Sankara. And of course, people loved his ideas because his ideas were very simple, right? Like you said it before. what he said was just common sense. It wasn't even like he was saying something real radical or whatever. He was just saying, listen, this grows here. We got to eat what grows here until we can get to a different place in our life. Um, so what Thomas Sankara was saying to people was like things that just made sense to them. You know, other revolutionaries, they had all these complicated ideas that came from studying in Paris and Marxism and all these things that people didn't really understand. But Thomas Sankara, he said, you know, what Marxism, whatever, yeah, I'm very influenced by it. But here's the three, four things that really matter to the people, and this is what I'm going to focus on. And I think that's why people really gravitated towards him.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to remain there again because I'm really going to be very sure that the point is driven home. In that, now, Thomas Sankara told the people what he wanted. For a certain period of time, he was a leader. So, somebody decided to kill him, eliminate him. This person become the leader. What did the population do to this individual who eliminated Thomas Sankara if they understood the message that he had brought to them?
They did nothing to Blaise Compaoré. I mean, Blaise Compaoré, his support came from like unions, like trade unions. So I guess like people who were kind of like more in the professional civil servant group were more supportive of Blaise Compaoré because Thomas Sankara was actually pretty hostile to unions, to like school unions and workers unions and things like that. He was pretty hostile to them. But as far as like the peasant class of people or like the, you know, that class of people that wasn't part of some kind of like working class, when Thomas Sankara died, they really couldn't do anything. Like you just said, they didn't have the tools to rebel in the ways that they do in the present day, right? Like the revolution in Burkina Faso, it didn't get a lot of media coverage, but like it was very important. Like people were recording, like people have phones in their pockets. They're, you know, calling out Blaise Compaoré on all types of social media and things like that. These are not tools that they had in the 1980s and the 1990s. So, right, like people, when Thomas Sankara died, there were the people who did support him and were very devastated by it, but didn't have the tools to protest it. And then you had the people who were supportive of the killing of Thomas Sankara because Thomas Sankara was hostile to their interests, which were essentially colonial interests.
Yes, certainly. Those interests. Anyway, you see, I'm just trying to dodge the European influence here, not because it's not important, because I'm trying to make sure that we concentrate on the part that is us, our responsibility. In 2010, I wrote a book that I titled, that development in Africa, my hands are clean. I was trying to tell Africa, let's look at our responsibility, our role in what is happening. Forget what has happened, other people have done to us. The reason is this one, it's very simple. The European, the American, they are not ready to stop. So why should I be wasting my energy on them instead of trying to build my home? Let us build our home. Let's solve the problem. Then we shall be ready to defend what we have built. So this guy eliminated Thomas Sankara, and the idea just died like that?
Of course not. I think people, I mean, the group that overthrew Blaise Compaoré actually called themselves Sankarists, right? They modeled these, you know, one of the leaders of the group that overthrew Blaise Compaoré, he literally has a song that's about a homage to Thomas Sankara. So these ideas don't die, but again, like you said before, the leadership in Africa, they grab power and they hold on to it very, very tightly, and they conduct regimes that are really suppressive of these ideas. And one of the things that Blaise Compaoré did was there was no, you could not talk about Thomas Sankara, you could not wear a shirt, you couldn't put a poster up, you couldn't read any books that had to do, any papers that had to do with Thomas Sankara. So I'm sure these ideas lasted and they persevered in their own ways. But these are things that, unfortunately, from a historical point of view, that we don't really have a lot of access to, because a lot of the materials that would make this clear were confiscated. They were confiscated and they were not allowed to, you know, be circulated from a historical point of view. But obviously these ideas didn't die if people from generations later, people who never even saw Thomas Sankara a day in their life, have adapted his name to a political party and overthrew the very man who assassinated Thomas Sankara. So of course these ideas didn't die, and I'm so excited. I mean, Burkina Faso is going through their own difficulties right now, but I am just so proud, if I can use that word, that the people in Burkina Faso are fighting on. You can actively see it. They are fighting on the daily. Even the other day, I just saw on the news a couple of months ago, small little kid. He took a slingshot and shot down a French drone. I mean, these are all things that are a product of Thomas Sankara's just revolutionary attitude, and they are fighting so hard to live up to the name that Thomas Sankara gave them, and the legacy that Thomas Sankara left. And I think that it's a wonderful thing. And we can sit here and we can talk about how Africans are doing this wrong or that wrong, but at the same time, we are such a resilient people, and we continue to fight. We continue to fight, the reactionary stuff that's within our own ranks, outside of our ranks. But I think that at the end of the day, like, we are a resilient people who continues to fight under these principles that people like Thomas Sankara have given us.
Now, I wanted to speak to one fact, one issue, one concern that I have, no, which is the idea of the strong man. I think in Africa, we no longer need strong men. We need strong people. In that, you look at maybe in the case of Gaddafi, I don't know whether Gaddafi is actually a good example, because he was used a number of times to destabilize many situations. And at the end of the day, when it began to, I don't know whether he realized that what he was doing was wrong, trying to paint himself good, then they decided to eliminate him, which of course just show to you, this is what awaits you when you are working with the enemy. You must clearly identify who is your enemy, who are you working for, because there is a price for everything.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that the idea of the strong man, or like this one leader, we have outgrown that. And I think it served a very specific purpose. I think in a certain sense, it did take like that one person to like really lead, right? And say like, hey, listen, we have to get out of this situation. But I think that one of the groundworks that people like Thomas Sankara have laid was the power needs to come from the people, needs to come from below. Nothing that anybody up top does is going to help you. You have to help yourselves. I think all they did was like pave an avenue, pave a way. But Thomas Sankara, and people like Thomas Sankara, they made it possible for that idea that it is the people that create change, not one person. There's not one person who, Thomas Sankara says it himself, he says, you guys are looking for some kind of savior, you're looking for some kind of messiah. I'm not a messiah. I'm not going to change things by myself. I'm here to help. I'm here to, guide in a certain way. But at the end of the day, like, it's whatever y'all want to do. If y'all want this to succeed, it's going to succeed. If y'all don't want it to succeed, it's not going to succeed. So I agree with you that the era of the Messiah, the Black Messiah, it definitely is. We have outgrown that phase for sure.
Mm-hmm. I would still like you to speak again to this issue, because it's so important, though. Because in Africa, I want to believe that at least you listen to some program, maybe on Clubhouse or some places, where Africans are talking, where we are always cry for leader, But at the end of the day, we are going to be our leader. So of course, it takes also the responsibility of the person who we give our power to, because politics is, I give a little bit of my own, a little bit of your own, then we saddle it on an individual to represent us. So that person becomes powerful. It's powerful because we have given him power. If we take that power away from him, he's just like every other person. So now, how do we nurture the idea in the people, the responsibility that all of us, we are going to be part of it? And of course, there is a responsibility also of the person who we have saddled with our power and the responsibility, so that at the end of the day, all of us are going to be strong. This is why. If we make one individual strong, that individual can be taken out anytime, any day. If that is the only one we haven't got anybody. But if we make 100 people strong, if you send the US Marine to come, it will be difficult for them to be taking down 100 people at a time. By the time they take down 2, the other people will rearm themselves. So in Africa today, in 2022, we don't need strong men. We need strong people. How do we empower Africa? Starting from our mind. How do we do that?
I think education is a huge bit. And I think that we need to really, really reimagine how we're educating ourselves. I know I'm very biased because I'm a historian, but I think the learning of our history is extremely important. And I've had a lot of friends from all over Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, DRC, all sorts of places. History is not a big is not a topic that you necessarily learn because there are so many ethnic groups, and the concept of a nation is still very, complex in Africa. But I think that the learning of history is one of the biggest steps that you can take, because I think this idea that the colonial powers have just come down and just destroyed everything, I think is also is very too simple. And I think we need to understand how powerful we are as a people, that we're not helpless, that we've never been helpless. Even under colonialism, even under Europe, we've never been helpless. We've always been resilient. We've always been resistant. We've always been powerful. And I think when we stop telling ourselves that we're victims of this or victims of that, that's when we will start to see the power that we can have in each and every one of us and as a collective. So I think, learning of history, learning of the true history, not just history, learning of the true history will really empower us to say, I'm not a victim. I'm not powerless. I do have a lot of power here. And I think that's one of the first steps that we can take.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now back to Thomas Sankara again, because he's our reference here. He's a leader, a great, not just a leader, but a great leader. Now, how do you describe his whole philosophy in a way that ordinary people can understand it?
I think Thomas Sankara is, to use a term, humanist. And when I say humanist, I believe that he believes, just like how we were talking about, he believes in the ability and the power of people to enact change, the power of ordinary people to enact change. That's what we see throughout all of Thomas Sankara's philosophies. He was a feminist, right? We don't talk about how Thomas Sankara was a huge champion of women. He was a feminist, he was an environmentalist. All of those things that he was, though, was underpinned by his belief that humans had the power in themselves to enact change. So I think that's one of the most basic ideas that you need in order to understand Thomas Sankara.
All right. Now, this series is titled Life and Legacy. So maybe, for example, you were to say, this is the legacy of Thomas Sankara today. I don't know, maybe you are telling it to a child or something. When you talk about a child, you talk about your story, then you also have a kind of a moral lesson at the end of the day. So what would you say is the real legacy of Thomas Sankara?
The real legacy of Thomas Sankara. I think the real legacy of Thomas Sankara is, again, to not be afraid, right? I think one of the things, to never be afraid and to always stand up for what's right, I think that's really the moral of it, is to never be afraid to stand up for what's right. Because Thomas Sankara even said he knew he wasn't going to live for a long time. And like you said, if you instill power in one person, that person can be taken out. But one of the things Thomas Sankara said is, there are 100 Sankaras here in Burkina Faso. If you take me out, there will be 100 more Thomas Sankaras. That's exactly what he said. You can read it in his speeches yourself. So again, he says to never be afraid to stand up for what you believe, because when you do that, you inspire other people and you create a wave of people who have that ability to stand up for what's right. And you can't take out all of them, right? You can take out one person, but you can't take out all of them. So again, never be afraid to stand up for what's right.
Thank you so much for that. Now, say somebody want to find out about you, or I don't know if you have some offer out there, maybe a book or anything, they want to read more about you or connect with you. How can they do that? Please do that shortly.
Yeah, so you can either connect with me on LinkedIn, which is Kai Mora. I have my Instagram channel called @thefanonian. And if you do want to read any of my work, you can look at The Republic, which is a Nigerian magazine, a really great Nigerian magazine. And then I've also been published on other places like history.com. So really just Google me, right? Just Google me, and you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or anything like that. I will for sure respond to you. You can connect with me on Instagram. I'm happy to talk with anybody about any of these wonderful things.
Thank you so much. This conversation has really been very interesting, dear Kaya. Now, what would be your final message? I don't know. Of course, we talk about a lot of things today related to Thomas Sankara. Now, maybe there is one thing you wanted to say that I didn't ask you, or kind of a conclusion, in a way, your own way. What would that be? Please go.
My last statement would be to study Thomas Sankara. Really, I don't know. I'm somebody who's really into just reading primary sources. When I say primary sources, I mean straight from the horse's mouth. I mean, reading his speeches will give you all the insight that you need. Like, yes, it's great to read biographies and things like that, but the first thing I ever did when I encountered Thomas Sankara was read his speeches. Before you even think about reading what somebody else has to say about him, read for yourself what the man has said, because then you can create your own opinion, so that no matter what anybody else says, you say, I know what he said for myself. I don't need anybody to tell me what he said, because I know for myself. And that's not just for Thomas Sankara, that's for any revolutionary, every African political thinker, any Black, Caribbean, Afro-Latin person. You read for yourself what they have to say, because people will tell you all sorts of things about who they are and what they did and blah, 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 blah. I don't hear none of it. I know what they say for myself, and I know what I believe, and I know what they believe.
That has been a beautiful time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.